Hello, hello, hello! Greetings, salutations! Konnichiwa, and every other form of green across this vast, marvelous multiverse. I am Matsu Quinox. This is Horace, and welcome back, my dear, marvelous, wonderful scholars, to the study. Hello there, hello there, hello there. Hello there, Julian 20, welcome. Congratulations on getting first. Hello there, Firefly, welcome. Hello, 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 all you wonderful scholars, wherever you are, whenever you are across this vast, magnificent omniverse. How are you all doing this fine evening, morning, or afternoon? I hope you're all doing well. Excuse me. Julian 20, just fine on this snowy evening. Oh, it's snowing where you are. Oh my goodness, I hope it's not too much. I know for some people snow can be a real pain. For some, snow can be a delight. I'm somewhere in between. But I hope you're doing well and safe. Julian 20, no, not much. Oh, good, 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 good. Oh my goodness. Well, today's been an okay day. Kind of busy. Not too busy, of course, but it's been okay over here in the study. Oh, it feels like a long time since we've been in this room. I almost forgot that we had it. Oh, Horace and I came back in here and we had to clean up a little bit. Oh, there were books everywhere. There was some cobwebs. Oh, it was terrible. It was terrible. But we got it all nice and neat and ready for tonight. 20, it has been a long time. Oh, yes, yes, yes. It has been a long time. I mean, the last readings we did, oh my goodness, they were all in that other room. Oh, but it's good to be here. It's good to be back here again, and it's good to be reading again. I love reading, and I hope you're all enjoying this. Oh, oh my goodness, I'm talking too much. Gotta open up water. Julian 20, welcome home. Aw, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, ah, ah. But tonight, my dear scholars. Oh, before I forget, thank you, Capsule J, for the follow. I forgot to mention them a while back. Oh my goodness. Thank you for the follow and welcome to our little group of scholars. I'm Matsu Quinox, interdimensional omniversal librarian. This is my companion, my friend, my assistant, and my roommate, Horace. Yes, so it's good to be back though, and I'm glad I am always happy to have new followers because I do this all for you, my dear scholars. All these readings, all these game streams, they're all for you. But, you know what? Tonight, my dear scholars, we are continuing our reading of Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. Oh my goodness, it feels like 80 days since you've read it. Oh, but yes, where we last left off. So last we left off, I gotta remember the names of these characters. Phineas Fogg, a mysterious, rich, wealthy man, has made a bet with the members of the Reform Club that he can circle the world in 80 days. He is already in India. On his tail, though, is oh my goodness, I need to remember these names. Fix, yes, Fix. Inspector Fix, who believes that Phineas Fogg is, in fact, the man who robbed the Bank of England. And of course, of course, Phineas Fogg, having a mysterious background, well, he could be, couldn't it? Along the way, Phineas Fogg has Passepartout, who is his trusty servant, and right now they are in India about to rescue a Indian woman who is about to be burned alive. Very dramatic, very dramatic. Before I start reading, though, I should warn you, of course, that this book was written in the 1800s. Jules Verne was of that era. So there are cultural observations and terms which are not exactly accurate to modern day. Um, I will. Firefly. Have I missed a reading? I don't know Firefly. I really can't tell, unfortunately. Um, this is our third reading of this book, so I don't know. I couldn't. I can't tell you Firefly. I'm sorry. Oh, hello there, Dr. Zadium. Welcome. Glad to have you here. But yes, there are viewpoints in this book, novel, what have you, which are not accurate, or at least they're through the lens of 18th century, of 19th century European eyes. So it's always best to take it with a bit of salt and understand that we do not condone any of these negative views, but it is but but we will be reading the book as it is, pausing only to edit out maybe some language issues that I feel uncomfortable reading. So, my dear scholars, are you ready to continue our journey around the world in 80 days? Oh, excuse me. Julian 20, yes, please. All right. Then sit back, relax, have a hot or cold beverage, whatever is of your liking. Dim the lights if you wish, and let us continue our reading of Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Excuse me. Chapter 13, in which Passepartout proves once again that fortune favors the bold. The plan was daring, fraught with difficulty, and perhaps impossible. Mr. Fogg was going to risk his life, or at least his freedom, and thereby the success of his project. But he had no hesitation. In any case, he had in Sir Francis Cromarty a staunch ally. Passepartout, for his part, was ready for action, and he was at their command. His master's idea filled him with enthusiasm. He realized there was a heart and a soul beneath this cold exterior. He was beginning to take to Phileas Fogg. There remained the guide. Whose side would he take in this business? Wouldn't he be for the Indians? Even if he wouldn't help them, they needed to make sure he remained neutral. Sir Francis Cromarty asked the question point blank. Sir, replied the guide, I'm a Parsee, and this woman is a Parsee. I'm at your command. Good, replied Mr. Fogg. Nevertheless, you must realize, continued the Parsee, that we're in danger not only of losing our lives, but also of being horribly tortured if we're captured. So think about it. We have, answered Mr. Fogg. I feel we must wait until nightfall before taking action. So do I, said the guide. The worthy Indian then gave some details about the victim. She was an Indian lady famous for her beauty, a Parsee by race and the daughter of a wealthy family of Bombay merchants. She had received a thoroughly English upbringing in the city, of course, and from her manners and her schooling she could have been taken for a European. Of course. Of course you have to realize, my dear scholars, this being the 19th century, there were viewpoints about pairing up characters that they had to be, let's just say, compatible in some manner. As irritating and as off kilter nowadays that it would be. Her name was Iota. After being orphaned, she had been married against her will to this elderly Raja from Bundelkhand. 3 months later, she was widowed. Knowing the fate that awaited her, she ran away, but was immediately caught, and the relatives of the Raja, who would benefit from her death, condemned her to this punishment, from which she seemed to have no escape. This story could only strengthen Mr. Fogg and his companions in their generous resolve. Oh, hello there, One True L. Welcome! We've just begun our reading of Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Thank you for being here. This story could only strengthen Mr. Fogg and his companions in their generous resolve. It was decided that the guide would lead the elephant toward the temple of Pilagi, which he would get as near to as possible. Hopefully I am pronouncing these names right. I apologize if I'm not. Half an hour later they came to a halt in a thicket, 500 yards from the temple, which they could not see, but the howling of the fanatics could be clearly heard. Then they discussed how to reach the victim. The guide knew this temple, in which he said the young woman was being held prisoner. Would it be possible to get in through one of the doors while the group were deep in a drugged stupor, or would they have to make a hole in the wall? It was not possible to come to a decision there and then, but what was beyond doubt was that a rescue would have to take place that night, and not the next day when the victim was being taken to her death. By that time, no human intervention would be able to save her. Montreal round the world. Yes, 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 indeed. Mr. Fogg and his companions waited for night to fall. As soon as the light began to fade, towards 6 in the evening, they decided to reconnoiter, don't know that word, the area around the temple. The final shouts of the fakirs were dying away as they did so. As was their habit, the Indians must have been in a drug-induced stupor, the result of taking, I am going to butcher this term, Bahang? It's Bhang. I'm not very good with this. Bahang? Liquid opium mixed with an infusion of hashish. Oh wow, that must be potent. It would perhaps therefore be possible to slip past them to get to the temple. Guiding Mr. Fogg, Sir Francis Cromarty, and Passepartout, Guiding Mr. Fogg, Sir Francis Cromarty, and Passepartout, the Parsi advanced through the forest without making a sound. After crawling for about 10 minutes through the thick undergrowth, they reached the edge of a small river, and there, by the light of iron torches tipped with burning resin, they glimpsed a carefully constructed wood pile. It was the funeral pyre made from precious sandalwood and already soaked in sweet-smelling oils. On the upper part rested the embalmed body of the Rajah, which was to be burnt at the same time as his widow. 100 yards from the pyre stood the temple, whose towers reached up into the darkened tree-tops. "Come on," whispered the guide. Then, taking even more care, and with his companions following him, he crept silently through the tall grass. Excuse me. The silence was now broken only by the soughing of the wind in the branches. Soon the guide stopped at the edge of a clearing. A few torches lit up the area. The ground was strewn with groups of people asleep, sunk in a drug-induced stupor. It looked like a battlefield covered with corpses. Men, women, and children were all lying together. Here and there a few drunken bodies let out groans. In the background, between the mass of trees, the temple of Pilagi could be dimly seen. But to the great disappointment of the guide, the Rajah's guards, illuminated by the smoke-blackened torches, were keeping watch at the doors, and were walking around with their sabers drawn. It could safely be assumed that inside the priests were also keeping watch. The Parsee did not move any further forward. He had realized the impossibility of forcing their way into the temple, and he made his companions move back. Well, thank you for the hydrate one, Truel. Thank you. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty had understood, like him, that they couldn't attempt anything on their side. They stopped and spoke to one another in a whisper. "Let's wait," said the Brigadier General. "It's still only 8 o'clock, and it's possible that the guards will also fall asleep." "Yes, that's quite possible," replied the Parsee. So Phileas Fogg and his companions lay down at the foot of a tree and waited. To them, time seemed to go by very slowly. The guide left them from time to time and went to look at the edge of the wood. The Rajah's guards were still keeping watch by the glare of the torches, and a faint trickle of light was coming through the windows of the temple. They waited like this until midnight. There was no change in the situation, and the guards remained outside. It was obvious that the guards couldn't be relied on to succumb to drowsiness. They had probably been spared the effects of Bahanji. So there would have to be another solution. Gain in through the opening that would have to be made in the temple walls. There remained the problem of knowing whether the priests were keeping as careful a watch over their victim as were the soldiers at the gate of the temple. After a final conversation, the guide said he was ready to move. Mr. Fogg, Sir Francis, and Passepartout followed him. They made quite a long detour in order to reach the temple by the back of the building. At about midnight they arrived at the foot of the walls without encountering anyone. No attempt had been made to guard this side, but it must be said that there were absolutely no windows or doors. The night was dark. The moon, then in its final quarter, was hardly above the horizon and was obscured by heavy clouds. The height of the trees further increased the darkness. But getting to the foot of the walls wasn't the end of it. They still had to make an opening in them. For this operation, Phileas Fogg and his companions had absolutely nothing except their pocket knives. Very fortunately, the temple walls were made of a mixture of brick and wood that couldn't be difficult to get through. As soon as one brick had been removed, the others would come away easily. They got down to work, making as little noise as possible. The Parsee on one side, and Passepartout on the other set about dislodging the bricks in order to make an opening 2 feet wide. The work was progressing when suddenly a shout rang out inside the temple, and almost immediately there was more shouting in reply from outside. Passepartout and the guide broke off what they were doing. Had they been spotted? Had someone raised the alarm? The most basic common sense dictated that they should move away, which is what they did, at the same time as Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty. They crouched back down under the cover of the wood, waiting for the alarm, if that is what it was, to be over, and ready, in that case, to resume their work. But by an unfortunate turn of events, some guards showed up at the back of the temple and took up position there in order to prevent anyone getting near. It would be hard to describe the disappointment of the 4 men, stopped before their task was complete. Now that they couldn't reach the victim, how could they rescue her? Sir Francis Cromarty was fuming. Passepartout was beside himself with anger, and the guide had difficulty restraining him. The impassive Fogg waited without showing his feelings. All we can do, yeah, all we can do is go away, isn't it? Whispered the brigadier general. All we can do is go away, replied the guard. Wait, said Fogg. All I need is to be by. All I need is to be in Allahabad by midday. But what are you hoping for? Asked Sir Francis. In a few hours it will be daylight, and our luck may change at the vital moment. The Brigadier General would have liked to have been able to read the expression on Phileas Fogg's face. So what was this cold Englishman counting on? Did he want, just as the young woman was to be sacrificed, to rush towards her and snatch her from the grasp of her executioners in full view of everyone? It would have been an act of madness, and how could anyone think him as mad as that? Nevertheless, Sir Francis Cromarty agreed to wait until the final act of this horrible drama. However, the guide did not allow his companions to stay in the place where they had sought refuge, and he led them back to another part of the clearing. From there, under the shelter of a clump of trees, they would be able to observe the groups of people asleep. Meanwhile, Passepartout, perched on the lowest branch of a tree, was turning over in his mind an idea that had first occurred to him in a flash, and that had now taken a firm hold. He had said to himself at first, "This is madness," and now he kept on repeating to himself, "Why not, after all? It is a possibility, perhaps the only one, and with maniacs like this around." In any case, Passepartout spent no more time organizing his thoughts, but instead, with the agility of a snake, he slithered along the lower branches of the tree, which reached almost down to the ground. Time was passing, and soon a few hints of light suggested that dawn was on its way. However, it was still quite dark. Now was the moment. The sleeping crowd showed signs of coming back to life. People were stirring. The striking of gongs could be heard. Chanting and shouting burst out again. The time had come for the unfortunate woman to die. Right. At that very moment, the doors of the temple opened. The light coming from inside became brighter. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis were able to see the victim, now clearly illuminated, being dragged out by two priests. They even thought that by a supreme effort of self-preservation, the unfortunate woman was shaking off the effects of her drug-induced drowsiness and attempting to escape from her executioners. Sir Francis Cromarty's heart leapt, and impulsively seizing Phileas Fogg's hand, he realized that the latter was holding an open knife. Again. At that point, the crowd began to move forward. The young woman had relapsed into the torpor induced by the hashish fumes. She went past the fakirs, who accompanied her with their religious incantations. Again, I don't know if anything of this is actually accurate. It may not be, might be with little bits of exaggeration. It's hard to say. Again, we're getting the point of view of a Frenchman writing in the 19th century. She went past the fakirs, who were accompanying her with their religious incantations. Phileas Fogg and his companions, merging with those at the back of the crowd, followed her. 2 minutes later they reached the edge of the river, and stopped less than 50 yards from the funeral pyre, where the Rajah's body was laid out. In the semi-darkness they could see the victim looking absolutely lifeless, lying next to her husband's corpse. Then a torch was brought forward, and the wood, which had been soaked with oil, caught fire immediately. At that moment, Sir Francis Cromarty and the guide attempted to restrain Phileas Fogg, who in a moment of generous insanity began to rush toward the pyre. But Phileas Fogg had already pushed them back when the scene suddenly changed. A cry of terror rang out. The whole crowd flung themselves to the ground in fear. So the old Raja was not dead after all? Suddenly he rose to his feet like a ghost, lifted the young woman up in his arms, and stepped down from the pyre amid the swirling smoke, looking like a ghostly apparition. The fakirs, guards, and priests were overcome with a sudden terror and remained prostrate, not daring to raise their eyes to behold this supernatural event. The unconscious victim was taken up and carried away by a pair of strong arms, as if she were as light as a feather. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty had remained standing. The Parsee had bowed his head, and no doubt Passepartout was equally amazed. So it was that the ghostly apparition got near to where Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty were standing, and there it said curtly, "Let's get out of here." It was Passepartout himself who had crept towards the pyre in the midst of the thick smoke. It was Passepartout who, taking advantage of the fact that it was still pitch dark, had snatched the young woman from her death. It was Passepartout who, playing his role with consummate daring, had walked through the terror-struck crowd. A moment later the four disappeared into the wood, and the elephant carried them swiftly away. But shouting and screaming and even a bullet, which went through Phileas Fogg's hat, were proof that their ruse had been discovered. The body of the old Raja could now be clearly seen on the burning pyre. The priests had recovered from their fright and now realized that a rescue had just taken place. Immediately they rushed into the forest, followed by the guards. A volley of shots rang out, but the rescuers fled rapidly, and within a few moments they were beyond the range of the bullets and arrows. It's kind of interesting how in the movie version of this, the 1950 movie at least, I haven't seen the other adaptations, they really shortened this scene by quite a bit. The rescue is pretty much the same, but there's no drugged scenes, there's none of that sort of thing, and it's done very, very quickly. But then again, they don't have the time to actually do the full scene, it seems. Chapter 14, in which Phileas Fogg travels the whole length of the wonderful valley of the Ganges without thinking it worth a look. Well, that's rather rude of him. Excuse me. The bold rescue plan had come off. An hour later, Passepartout was still reveling in his success. Sir Francis Cromarty had shaken the intrepid fellow's hand. His master had said to him, "Well done," which, coming from the gentleman in question, was the equivalent of the highest praise, to which Passepartout had replied that all the credit lay with his master. All that he had done was to have a daft idea, and he was still amused by the thought that for a few moments he, Passepartout, the former gymnast and ex-fireman, had been this charming lady's widower, an elderly embalmed Raja. As for the young Indian lady, she had not been aware of what had happened. Wrapped in travel rugs, she was resting in one of the baskets. Meanwhile, the elephant, under the expert guidance of the Parsee, was advancing rapidly through the forest, where it was still dark. An hour after leaving the temple of Pilagi, the elephant began to cross an immense plain. At 7 o'clock they made a halt. The young woman was still completely prostrate. The guide gave her a few drops of water and brandy to drink, but her drugged state would last some time longer. Sir Francis Cromarty, who was well aware of the effects of inhaling hashish fumes, had no worries on her score. However, If the young Indian woman's recovery was not in doubt, her safety was, in the Brigadier General's mind, quite another matter. He was not afraid to say to Mr. Fogg that if she remained in India she would inevitably fall into the hands of her would-be executioners. These fanatics were to be found over the whole of the subcontinent, and it was certain that despite the best efforts of the British police, they would succeed in recapturing their victim, whether it be in Madras, Bombay, or Calcutta. To back up his argument, Sir Francis quoted a similar recent case. In his opinion, the young woman would only really be safe once she had left India. Phileas Fogg replied that he would take account of these remarks, and would then make up his mind accordingly. At about 10 o'clock, the guide announced that they had arrived at the station in Allahabad. This was where the railway line picked up again, and from where trains took less than a day and a night to cover the distance between Allahabad and Calcutta. Phileas Fogg should therefore arrive in time to catch a steamer that didn't leave for Hong Kong until midday the following day, 25th of October. They installed the young woman in a waiting room at the station. Passepartout was given the task of going out to buy her various items of clothing, a dress, a shawl, furs, etc., whatever he could find. His master set no limit on how much he could spend. I have to wonder then, if they're buying clothes for her, how do they know it's gonna fit? And the fact that she's unconscious. Yeah, best not to think of it. Excuse me. Passepartout left immediately, and went all around the town. Allahabad is the city of God, one of the holiest cities in India, because it is built where two sacred rivers meet, the Ganges and the Jumna. I hope I pronounced that right. Again, I'm really bad at pronouncing some of these names. Whose waters attract pilgrims from the whole subcontinent. In addition, it is well known that, according to the legends of the Ramayana, the Ganges has its source in the heavens, from where, thanks to Brahma, it comes down to this earth. As he made his purchases, it didn't take Passepartout long to see the whole of the town, which in the past had been defended by a magnificent fort that is now a state prison. There were no longer any businesses or industries in what had previously been an important commercial and industrial center. Passepartout searched in vain for a department store as if he was in Oxford Street, but he had to go to a second-hand shop run by a... I apologize for this next sentence. A pernickety old Jew. Thank you, Jules Verne. To find the items he needed: a tartan dress, a large cloak, and a magnificent fur coat made out of otter skin, which he had no hesitation in paying £75 for. Then he returned in triumph to the station. Mrs. Aouda was beginning to come around. Aouda, I think it's Aouda, was beginning to come around. The effect of the drug administered by the priests of Piligi was gradually wearing off, and her beautiful eyes were recovering all their gentle Indian charm. Celebrating the beauty of the Queen of Ahmadnagar, the poet King Yusuf Adil wrote as follows. We have a little poem here. Her glistening hair, carefully parted, frames the gently flowing outline of her delicate white cheeks that gleam with a smooth sheen. Her eyebrows, dark as ebony, have the shape and strength of the bow of Kama, the god of love, and beneath her silky long eyelashes, in the dark pupils of her large clear eyes, there shimmer, as in the sacred lakes of the Himalayas, the purest reflections of celestial light. Her delicate, perfect white teeth shine out between smiling lips, like dewdrops in the half-closed cups of a pomegranate flower. Her dainty, perfectly shaped ears, her rose-red hands, her tiny feet rounded and delicate like lotus buds, sparkle like the finest Ceylon pearls and the most dazzling Golconda diamonds. Her slender, supple waist, which a single hand could enclasp, set off the elegant curve of her back and the fulsomeness of her bosom, in which the flowering of youth spreads forth its most perfect treasures. And beneath the silken folds of her garments she seems as if crafted in pure silver by the divine hand of Vishwakarma, the sculptor of the gods. Putting aside these rhetorical flourishes, it is enough to say that Mrs. Ayoda, the widow of the Rajah of Bundelkhand, was a charming woman, in the full European sense of the word. You just couldn't leave it well alone, could you, Jules Verne? She spoke perfect English, and the guide had certainly not been exaggerating when he said that this young Parsi woman had been transformed by her education. Again, I know what he means, but it does bother me a little that that's the measurement he's using to describe the sort of person she is. It just bothers me a little. Meanwhile, the train was about to leave Allahabad station. The Parsi was waiting. Mr. Fogg paid him his wages at the agreed rate, and not a penny extra. Passepartout was surprised at this because he realized how much of his master owed to the guide's devotion to duty. After all, the Parsi had willingly risked his life in the Pelagi business, and if he was later caught by the Hindus, he was unlikely to escape their vengeance. There remained the question of Kioni. Kyouni. I can't pronounce this. Kyouni. What was to be done with an elephant that had cost so much? But Phileas Fogg had already made up his mind about the matter. Parsi, he said to the guide, you have been helpful and devoted. I have paid for your help, but not your devotion. Would you like this elephant? If so, he is yours. The guide's eyes lit up. Your honor is giving me a fortune, he exclaimed. Take it, guide, replied Mr. Fogg, but even then I shall still be in your debt. Well done, exclaimed Passepartout. Take it, my friend. Kionuni is a trusted and courageous animal. Then he went up to the beast and gave him a few lumps of sugar, saying, Here, Kione. I'm trying to get my French accent again. Here, Kione, here. The elephant gave out a few grunts of satisfaction. Then he took Passepartout by the waist, and wrapping his trunk around him, lifted him as high as his head. Passepartout showed no sign of fear, and stroked the animal, which put him gently back on the ground. So, having received from the faithful Kiuni an elephant handshake, the dear fellow returned the compliment by taking the animal by the trunk and giving him a hearty human one. A few minutes later, Phileas Fogg, Sir Francis Cromarty, and Passepartout were installed in the comfortable carriage in which Mrs. Ayoda had the best seat, and were speeding towards Benares. Get a little bit more water. It is only 80 miles at the outside between the latter and Allahabad, and it took just 2 hours to cover them. During the journey, the young woman came round completely. The effects of the hashish fumes had fully worn off. It is easy to imagine her surprise at finding herself on a railway, in this compartment, wearing European clothes and surrounded by travelers who were total strangers. So, who dressed her? I mean, she was unconscious. I would hope that, Fogg would be at least decent enough to not, it just seems, I sometimes Verne needs to explain a few things. Julian 20, they did it carefully. I hope they did, for her sake. First of all, her companions showed her every care and attention, and revived her with a few drops of spirits. Then the Brigadier General recounted what had befallen her. He stressed the devotion of Phileas Fogg, how he had not hesitated to put his own life at risk to rescue her, and the final outcome of the adventure, thanks to Passpartout's bold stroke. Mr. Fogg added nothing to the account. Passepartout looked very embarrassed and kept saying, "It is nothing, it was nothing." Mrs. Aouda thanked her rescuers profusely, by her tears more than by her words. More than her lips, it was her beautiful eyes that expressed her gratitude. Then, as her thoughts returned to the scene of the suttee, and as she looked out again on the land of India, where so many dangers still awaited her, she suddenly shuddered with fear. Sorry. Phileas Fogg realized what was going through Mrs. Aouda's mind, and to reassure her he offered, albeit without showing any sign of emotion, to accompany her to Hong Kong, where she would stay until this whole business died down. Mrs. Aouda Mrs. Aouda gratefully accepted the offer. It was in Hong Kong, in fact, that one of her relatives lived, a Parsee like her, and one of the most important merchants in this city, which is thoroughly English, even though it is off the coast of China. Again, 19th century. At half past midday, the train stopped at the station at Benares. Hindu legend has it that the present city stands on the site of the ancient Kashi, which was formerly suspended in space between the zenith and the nadir, like Mohammed's tomb. But in these more prosaic times, Benares, the Athens of India, according to Orientalists, had come back down to earth with a jolt, and for a moment Passepartout was able to glimpse its brick houses and its wattle huts, which gave it an absolutely desolate appearance, devoid of all local color. Oh, that's a lovely. That's just well. That's that's a description. This is where Sir Francis Cromarty was due to end his journey. The troops he was returning to were encamped a few miles to the north of town. The Brigadier General therefore said his farewells to Phileas Fogg, wished him every success, and expressed the hope that he would continue his journey in a less eccentric but more profitable way. Mr. Fogg lightly shook his companion's hand. Mrs. Aouda's leave-taking showed far more affection. She would never forget what she owed Sir Francis Cromarty. As for Passepartout, he was given the honor of a real handshake by the Brigadier General. Visibly moved, he wondered where and when and how he might be able to be of service to him. Then they went their separate ways. After Benares, the railway went through part of the valley of the Ganges. When the weather was clear, they could see, out of the windows of the carriage, the varied landscape of Bihar, then green-clad mountains, fields of barley, maize and wheat, rivers and pools infested with greenish alligators, well-kept villages, and luxurious forests. Some elephants and zebus with big humps went down to bathe in the water of the sacred river, as did, despite the late time of year and the already low temperature, groups of Hindus of both sexes who were ritually purifying themselves. Their believers sworn. I apologize for these next passages if it offends anyone. I, again, it's Verne. These believers, sworn enemies of Buddhism, are faithful followers of the religion of Brahma, who is incarnated in through. Oh, thank you for the Oh my goodness, thank you for the raid, Steph Sue. Welcome, welcome, raiders. Oh, hello there, lurking Yoshi. Welcome. We're in the middle of reading Around the World in 80 Days, and we are getting to some slightly slightly troublesome passages. Oh my goodness, so many raiders. Oh my goodness. It is a fishy raid. Fishy raid. Welcome. I am Matsu Quinox, interdimensional omniversal librarian. This is Horace, and we welcome all you marvelous raiders here. Steph Seuss, troublesome, what's going on in the story? Well, we are going through India at this point, and it's very clear that we're seeing Verne's view of India through the lens of a 19th century European. There's some not so flattering descriptions in this. Or at least they are bluntly very much the viewpoint of that time. So Sue, how have you been? How were your holidays? I feel like it's been a minute since I could tune in. I took a break for a week actually. So it was fine. The holiday was good. I hope your holidays were fine too. Um, yeah, I'm glad to have you all here. Oh my goodness, I'm honored that you're all here. Thank you for being here. Yeah, I took a week off after just so I could get myself in gear. But we are back to reading Around the World in 80 Days. Need a hydration. Right now we are getting to a point where Verne is trying to describe Hinduism as best as he can. Steph Sue, it was a little relaxing, mostly work. Aw. Well, I hope that little bit of relaxing could help. You know? Any little bit helps. Okay, let's see this. Okay. Okay, again, I will warn you all. Verne, point of view of 19th century Europeans. I do not condone these views if he makes any mistakes like that. These believers, sworn enemies of Buddhism, are faithful followers of the religion of Brahma, who is incarnated in three forms: Vishnu, the sun god; Shiva, the divine personification of the forces of nature; and Brahma, the supreme ruler of priests and lawgivers. But what could Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu be thinking of the now Britannicized India that they looked on from above as a steamboat shrilly chugged past, disturbing the holy waters of the Ganges and scaring away the gulls that flew over its surface, the tortoises swarming along the riverbank and the faithful lying along its shores? Again, 19th century India was a very different place than it is now. Very different. This whole panorama went past in a flash, and often its details were hidden by a cloud of smoke. The travelers scarcely managed a glimpse of the fort at Chunar, 20 miles southwest of Benares, the former stronghold of the Rajas of Bihar, Gazipur, and its large rosewater factories, the tomb of Lord Cornwallis, erected on the left bank of the Ganges. Oh yes, Cornwallis died there, I forgot about that. The fortified town of Buxar, I think that's pronounced right. It's Buxar. That's a difficult word to say. Buxar, the large manufacturing and trading center of Patna, with the largest opium market in India. Again, times change. And Manhara, a town that is not merely European but as English as Manchester or Birmingham, famous for its iron foundries, its hardware and arms factories, and whose tall chimneys belch out black smoke into Brahma's heavens, in affront to this idyllic landscape. So you can see where you can see Private Maverick. Opium, a wonderful treat. Yeah, opium. Especially opium in this context. Yeah. Let's just say history was coming up pretty fast at this point. Also, you can see that Verne wasn't 100% down with the description with some of the things that were going on in India, at least a little bit. Verne being a very, very nationalistic Frenchman, he was very. It was difficult to read him sometimes when it came to his views on Britain. Then night came, and amid the howling of the tigers, bears, and wolves, oh my, that fled from the locomotive, the train went along at full speed, and nothing more could be seen of the beauties of Bengal, such as Golconda, the rules of Gore, Murshidabad, its former capital, Bundawan, Hooghly, or Chandernagore, a French outpost on India's soil, over which Passepartout would have been proud to see the flag of his native land flying. Finally, at 7 o'clock in the morning, they reached Calcutta. The steamer bound for Hong Kong was not due to sail until midday. Phileas Fogg therefore had 5 hours in front of him. According to his travel plan, the gentleman had been due to arrive in the Indian capital on the 25th of October, 23 days after leaving London, and he had arrived on the appointed day. So he was neither behind nor ahead of schedule. Unfortunately, the 2 days he had gained between London and Bombay had been lost, as has been seen during the crossing of the Indian subcontinent. However, it can be safely assumed that Phileas Fogg did not regret them. Ah. Again, it's hard to read those passages a little bit. I mean, to be semi-fair, Verne was a man of his time. On the other hand, it's hard to say, really. Again, I don't condone any sort of negative depictions of the area. Chapter 15, where the bag of banknotes becomes another several thousand pounds lighter. The train had stopped at the station. Passepartout was the first to get out of the carriage, followed by Mr. Fogg, who helped his young female companion to step down onto the platform. Excuse me. Phileas Fogg was intending to go straight to the steamer for Hong Kong in order to see that Mrs. Iota was comfortably settled in, as he did not want to leave her on her own as long as she remained in this country, where her safety was in danger. Just as Mr. Fogg was about to leave the station, a policeman came up to him and said, "Mr. Phileas Fogg?" "Yes." "Is this man your servant?" added the policeman, pointing to Passepartout. "Yes." Would both of you please follow me?" Mr. Fogg did not betray the least sign of surprise. The officer was a representative of the law, and for any Englishman the law is sanctosanct. Passepartout, reacting like a Frenchman, wanted to argue, but the policeman tapped him with his truncheon, and Phileas Fogg motioned him to obey. "May this young lady come with us?" asked Mr. Fogg. "She may." The policeman led Mr. Fogg, Miss Iota, and Passepartout towards a palki chari, a sort of four-wheeled, four-seater carriage drawn by two horses. They set off. No one spoke during the journey, which lasted about 20 minutes. Vern, you're really making this hard on me to read. Okay, I'll continue. I apologize, dear scholars. The carriage first of all went through the Indian quarter, with its narrow streets on either side of which stood huts swarming with a cosmopolitan, dirty, and ragged population. That's not fair, Vern. Then it entered the European quarter with its attractive brick houses, shaded by coconut trees and bristling with ship masts. Again, not fair. That isn't a. That's. No. Stop it. There, although it was still early in the morning, elegant riders and magnificent horse drawn carriages were out and about. The Balkigari stopped in front of a plain looking building, one that could not have been a private house. The policeman made his prisoners, there was no other word for them, get out, and he led them into a room with bars on the windows, saying to them, "At 8:30 you will appear before Judge Obadiah." Then he withdrew and closed the door. Excuse me. "That's it, we've been caught!" exclaimed Passepartout, collapsing onto a chair. Mrs. Iota turned towards Mr. Fogg and said to him in a voice that could not disguise her emotion, "Sir, you must leave me behind. It's because of me that you're being prosecuted. It's because you came to my rescue." Phileas Fogg replied only that it was not possible. To be prosecuted for the business of the settee? That was unacceptable. How could the plaintiffs dare to show themselves? There must be a mistake. Mr. Fogg added that in any case he would not leave the young woman behind, and would take her to Hong Kong. "But the boat leaves at midday," Passepartout pointed out. "We'll be on board before 12, was all the impassive gentleman said in reply. The statement was so categorical that Passepartout couldn't help saying to himself, "Goodness me, there's no doubt about it. By midday we'll be on board." But in fact he was far from convinced. At 8:30 the door in the room opened. The policeman reappeared, and showed the prisoners into the adjoining room. It was a courtroom, and a fairly large public made up of Europeans and natives was already inside. Mr. Fogg, Mrs. Iota, and Passepartout sat down on a bench opposite the seats reserved for the magistrate and the clerk to the court. The magistrate, Judge Obadiah, came in almost immediately, followed by the clerk of the court. He was a stout man with a roundish face. He took his wig down from a peg and put it on his head briskly. "Call the first case," he said. Then putting his hand on his head, he exclaimed, "Wait a minute. This isn't my wig." "Quite right, Mr. Obadiah. It's mine," replied the clerk. "My dear Mr. Oysterpuff, how do you expect a judge to pass judgment properly if he's wearing a clerk's wig?" An exchange of wigs duly took place. During these preliminaries, Passepartout could scarcely contain his impatience, because the hand on the large courtroom clock seemed to be moving extremely quickly. "The first case," repeated Judge Obadiah. "Phileas Fogg." "Here I am," replied Mr. Fogg. "Passepartout." "Présent," replied Passepartout. "Good," said the judge. "Prisoners at the bar. For 2 days the police have been looking out for you on every train from Bombay." "But what are we accused of?" Passepartout cried out impatiently. "You'll soon find out." "Your Honor," Mr. Fogg then said, "I am a British citizen, and have the right to—" "Have you been treated disrespectfully?" asked Judge Obadiah. "Not in the least." "Good. Bring in the plaintiffs." On the judge's orders a door opened, and 3 Hindu priests were shown in by a doorman. "Just as I thought," mumbled Passepartout. "These are the scoundrels who wanted to burn our young lady." The priest stood before the judge, and the clerk read out aloud the charge of sacrilege brought against Phileas Fogg, Esquire, and his servant, both accused of having violated a place sacred to the Hindu religion. "Have you heard the charge?" the judge asked Phileas Fogg. "Yes, my lord," replied Mr. Fogg, looking at his watch, "and I plead guilty." "Ah, you plead guilty," I plead guilty to the charge. I expect these three priests to plead guilty in turn to what they attempted to do at the Temple of Pilage. The priests looked at one another. They didn't seem to understand a word of what the accused was talking about. Certainly, exclaimed Passepartout impetuously, at the Temple of Pilage, in front of which they were about to burn their victim. The priests looked about even more mystified, and the judge extremely surprised. What victim? He asked. Burning who? In the middle of Bombay? Bombay? Cried out Passepartout. Certainly, it's got nothing to do with the temple at Pilage, but the temple at Malabar Hill in Bombay. And as evidence of his guilt here are the shoes used by the perpetrator of that act of desecration, added the clerk, placing a pair of shoes on his desk. My shoes! Shouted out Passepartout, who was surprised beyond belief and unable to prevent himself from coming out with this exclamation. It is easy to understand the confusion in the minds of both master and servant. They had forgotten about the incident in the Temple of Bombay, but this was what had brought them to the court in Calcutta. It is easy to understand the confusion in the minds of both master and... Oh, I just read that. Sorry about that, my dear scholars. What had happened was that Fix had realized the advantage he could gain from this unfortunate business. Delaying his departure by 2 hours, he had given legal advice to the priests of Malabar Hill, and had promised them a large sum in damages, knowing full well that the British government was very severe on this type of offence. Then he had sent them off by the next train hot in pursuit of the perpetrator of the sacrilege. However, as a result of the time it had taken to rescue the young widow, Fix and the Hindus arrived in Calcutta before Phileas Fogg and his servant, who were supposed to be arrested as soon as they stepped off the train, after the magistrates had been alerted by telegram. It was easy to imagine Fix's disappointment when he discovered that Phileas Fogg had not yet arrived in the Indian capital. He must have thought that his thief had stopped off at one of the stations along the peninsular railway and taken refuge in the northern provinces. For 24 hours Fix had watched out for him at the station, beset with anxiety. Imagine, then, his joy when that very morning he saw him get out of the carriage, accompanied, it is true, by a young woman whose presence was a mystery to him. He immediately sent a policeman off to follow him, and this is how Mr. Fogg, Passepartout, and the widow of the Rajah from Bundelkhand was brought before Judge Obadiah. Another drink. Sorry. What is more, if Passepartout had not been so taken up by his own situation, he would have noticed in the corner of the courtroom the presence of the detective, who was following the proceedings with understandable interest, since here in Calcutta, as in Bombay and Suez, he was still without his arrest warrant. However, Judge Obadiah had taken note of the admission of guilt that Passepartout had blurted out, though the latter would have given all he possessed to take back his reckless words. "Are the facts admitted?" said the judge. "Admitted," Mr. Fogg replied coldly. "Insofar as," continued the judge, "insofar as English law seeks to protect equally and strenuously all the religions of the peoples of India, the offence having been admitted by Mr. Passepartout, here convicted of having violated with his shoes the sanctity of the precincts of the temple of Malabar Hill during the day of 20th of October, the court hereby condemns the aforesaid Passepartout to 15 days' prison and a fine of £300. £300! Exclaimed Passepartout, who was only really concerned about the fine. "Silence!" barked the usher. "And," added Judge Obadiah, "insofar as it has not been materially proven that there was no complacency between the servant and his master, and in that in any case the latter must be held responsible for the deeds and actions of a servant in his employ. The court hereby detains the aforesaid Phileas Fogg and condemns him to 8 days' prison and a fine of 150. Clerk, call the next case. Fix in his corner felt an inexpressible sense of satisfaction. Detaining Phileas Fogg for 8 days in Calcutta gave more than enough time for the warrant to reach him. Excuse me. Passepartout was dumbfounded. This sentence meant that his master was ruined. A £20,000 bet had been lost, all because he had casually wandered into that wretched temple. Phileas Fogg, as firmly in control of himself as if the sentence concerned someone else, didn't raise an eyebrow. But, just at the moment when the clerk was calling the next case, he rose to his feet and said, "I wish to put up bail." "You are quite entitled to do so," replied the judge. Fix felt a shiver run down his spine, but he regained his composure when he heard the judge say that insofar as Phileas Fogg and his servant had the status of foreigners, he was fixing bail for each of them at the enormous sum of £1,000. It would cost Mr. Fogg £2,000 if he failed to serve his sentence. "I shall pay," the gentleman said. With that he took from the bag that Passepartout was carrying a wad of banknotes and put them down on the clerk's desk. "The sum of money will be returned to you when you leave prison," said the judge. "In the meantime you are free on bail." "Come on," said Phileas Fogg to his servant. "Let me at least have my shoes back," exclaimed Passepartout angrily. His shoes were given back to him. Trying to get his accent back. "They're an expensive pair of shoes," he muttered. "More than £1,000 each, not to mention the fact that they're killing me." Passepartout was absolutely crestfallen as he followed Mr. Fogg, who had offered Mrs. Aouda his arm. Fix was still hoping that the thief would never be prepared to write off this sum of £2,000, and that he would do his 8 days in prison. He therefore set off, following in Fogg's footsteps. Mr. Fogg called for a carriage, which Mrs. Aouda, Passepartout, and he got into straight away. Fix ran behind the carriage, which soon came to a stop at one of the quaysides in the town. Moored in the harbor half a mile offshore stood the Rangoon, ready to sail. 11 o'clock struck. Mr. Fogg was an hour early. Fix saw him get out of the carriage and into a small boat, along with Mrs. Aouda and his servant. The detective kicked the ground with his foot. Hold on one second, I gotta get this voice right. "That wretch!" he exclaimed. "He's off! £20,000 down the drain! A money waster as well as a thief! Well, I shall follow him to the ends of the earth if necessary, but at this rate all the money stolen will have gone by then." The police inspector was justified in thinking this. It was certainly true that since leaving London, between the cost of travel, the money spent on rewards, buying an elephant and paying the bail and the fines, Phileas Fogg had already used up more than £5,000 to get this far. And the proportion of the amount recovered, which would go to the detectives, was getting smaller all the time. I think this next chapter might be the last one for the evening. We shall see. I hope you're enjoying the story so far, even with some of the more troublesome passages, my dear scholars. Oh, the next chapter is a little bit shorter. Unit 20. Oh, yes. Oh, good, good. Glad to hear that. Chapter 16. Where Fix appears to have no knowledge at all of what he's being told. Oh, thank you for the posture check, Unit 20. Private Maverick, it's been good so far. Good. Glad to hear it. The Rangoon, one of the steamers that the Peninsular and Oriental Company uses on its service over the China Seas and the Sea of Japan, was an iron-hulled, propeller-driven ship, weighing 1,770 tons, unloaded, with a nominal 400 horsepower. It was as fast as the Mongolia, but not as comfortable. Mrs. Aoda's needs were not therefore as well catered for as Phileas Fogg would have liked. It was, though only a crossing of 3,500 miles, in other words, 11 or 12 days, and the young woman did not prove to be a very demanding passenger. Over the first few days of the crossing, Mrs. Aouda got to know Phileas Fogg better. At every opportunity she showed him the warmest gratitude. The phlegmatic gentleman listened to her with total detachment, or so it seemed, without betraying his tone of voice or his reaction the slightest emotion. He saw to it that the young woman had everything she wanted. He would regularly come at set times, if not to talk to her, then to where was I? Oh, there. Not to talk to her, then at least to listen to her. He treated her with a scrumptious respect for the rules of politeness, but his method had all the charm and spontaneity of an automaton whose movements have been specifically designed for this purpose. Mrs. Aouda didn't know exactly what to make of it, but Passepartout had explained to her a bit about his master's eccentric behavior. He had told her about the bet, which was the reason for the gentleman's journey around the world. Mrs. Aouda found this amusing, but after all she owed him her life, and this gratitude to her savior could only further endear him to her. Mrs. Aouda confirmed the Hindu guide's account of her touching story. She did indeed belong to the highest social class in Indian society. Several Parsi traders had made huge fortunes in India in the cotton trade. One of them, Sir James, I'm going to pronounce this terribly, Sir James Jejebhoy, had been knighted by the British government, and Mrs. Aouda was related to this wealthy individual, who lived in Bombay. It was a cousin of this very Sir James, the Honourable Jejeh, that she was expecting to meet up with in Hong Kong. Would he offer to take her in and help her? She couldn't say for sure. To which Mr. Fogg replied that she shouldn't worry, and that everything would turn out mathematically. That was the very word he used. Oh, hello there, Zen. Welcome! We are reading Around the World in 80 Days. They are just leaving for Hong Kong, it seems. No, they left Hong Kong, I think. I think they left Hong Kong. I'm running out. Losing track of where they are. Thank you for the hydrate, Step Sue. Did the young woman understand this appalling adverb? It is impossible to say. However, she looked at him with those great eyes of hers, eyes as clear as the sacred lakes of the Himalayas. But the unyielding Mr. Fogg, more buttoned up than ever, did not seem to be the sort of man who would plunge into such waters. The first part of the crossing on board the Rangoon went perfectly. The weather was kind to them. But this part of the immense bay the sailors call the Fathoms of Bengal, oh, so they're on their way to Hong Kong, favored the progress of the steamer. The Rangoon was soon within the sight of Grand Andaman, the main island in the group, easily recognizable to navigators thanks to the picturesque mountain of Saddle Peak, 2,400 feet high. They stayed quite close to the coast. Okay. This passage I really really dislike. Should I read it, my dear scholars? It's just not. Yeah, I hate this description so much. Should I read this part, dear scholars? This small little passage. What say you? I'll leave it in your hands. What say you, my dear scholars? Union 20, is it necessary? Not particularly. It's just a description of the inhabitants of the island, and it's really, really not a good description. Union 20, yeah, let's skip that little bit. Well, Zen, what does it say? Well, what do you say, Zen? Yeah, let's not that. Yeah, it's really insultive. The panoramic view of the islands was magnificent. Immense forests of fan palms, areca, areca, Arisa palms, bamboo, nutmeg, teaks, giant mimosas, and tree ferns made up the landscape to the foreground, and behind it stood the magnificent drop of the mountains. Zen, if we lose nothing by skipping, then there's no point. Yeah, you don't lose anything. It's almost pointless. It's really really insultive though, and I don't like those sort of writing. The coastline was swarming with thousands of these precious sea swallows, whose edible nests provide the Chinese with one of their most sought after delicacies. But the whole of this diverse spectacle offered by the view of the Andaman Islands soon came to an end, and the Rangoon headed swiftly for the Strait of Malacca, which led on to the China Sea. Meanwhile, what had become of Inspector Fix, who had been so unfortunately caught up in this journey of circumnavigation? As he was leaving Calcutta, he gave orders for the arrest warrant, if it eventually arrived, to be sent to him in Hong Kong. He had been able to get on board the Rangoon without being noticed by Passepartout, and he hoped to remain undiscovered until the steamer arrived. It would indeed have been difficult for him to explain his presence on board without arousing Passepartout's suspicions, since the latter must have thought he was in Bombay. But, as it turned out, he was destined to meet up with the dear fellow once again in circumstances that will soon be explained. All the police inspector's hopes and desires were now concentrated on one single spot, Hong Kong, since the steamer did not stop in Singapore long enough for him to be able to do anything there. So it was in Hong Kong that the thief's arrest had to take place. Otherwise, the thief would escape him for good, so to speak. Hong Kong was, it must be remembered, another British possession, but it was the last one on the journey. After that, China, Japan, and America offered a more or less safe haven to this man Fogg. In Hong Kong, if he finally got hold of the arrest warrant that must surely be on its way, Fix could arrest Fogg and hand him over to the local police. There was no problem about that. But after Hong Kong, a straightforward arrest warrant would no longer be enough. Extradition papers would be needed. That would lead to further delay, lengthy procedures, and obstacles of all sorts, which the scoundrel would take advantage of to get away once and for all. If the operation failed in Hong Kong, it would be, if not downright impossible, at least very difficult to repeat it with any real chance of success. So, Fix kept saying to himself during the long hours he spent in his cabin, so either the warrant is in Hong Kong and I can arrest my man, or it isn't, and in that case I'll have to delay his departure at all costs. I failed in Bombay, and I failed in Calcutta. If things don't work out in Hong Kong, my reputation will be ruined. Whatever happens, I must succeed. But what's the best way of delaying, if necessary, the departure of this wretched man, Fogg? As a last resort, Fix was quite determined to reveal everything to Passepartout, to make him realize the truth about the master he served, even though he definitely wasn't his accomplice. After being enlightened by these revelations, Passepartout would fear being implicated, and would certainly side with him, Fix. Nevertheless, this was a risky tactic, and one only to be used when all else had failed. One word from Passepartout to his master would be enough to completely wreck the whole plan. The police inspector was therefore in a very awkward position, until the presence of Mrs. Aouda on board the Rangoon opened up some new possibilities for him. Fix is kind of a jerk. Who exactly was this woman? What was the combination of circumstances that had made her Fogg's companion? The meeting must obviously have taken place between Bombay and Calcutta, but where exactly on the Indian subcontinent? Was it chance that had brought together Phileas Fogg and the young woman traveler? Or, on the contrary, had the gentleman undertaken his trip to India in order to meet up with this delightful person? And delightful she certainly was. Fix had realized this well enough in the courtroom in Calcutta. It is easy to understand how intriguing all this must have been for the detective. He wondered if there might not be an element of criminal abduction about this business. Yes, that must be it. This idea took firm hold in Fix's mind, and he realized all the advantage he could derive from the situation. Whether the young woman was married or not, it was still an abduction, and in Hong Kong it was possible to stir enough trouble for the abductor for him not simply to buy his way out. But something had to be done before the Rangoon reached Hong Kong. This man Fogg had the unpleasant habit of hopping from one boat to another, and before the operation got going he might already be far away. So the main thing was to alert the British authorities and to inform them that the Rangoon was on its way before it actually arrived. In fact, nothing could be simpler, since the steamer was due to put in at Singapore, and Singapore is linked to the Chinese mainland by telegraph. However, before doing anything, and just to be on the safe side, Fix made up his mind to question Passepartout. He knew that it wasn't very difficult to get this chap to talk, and so he decided to drop his disguise. There was therefore no time to lose. It was the 30th of October, and the following day the Rangoon was due to put into Singapore. Accordingly, that very day Fix left his cabin and went up on deck with the intention of going to Passepartout and making great play of how surprised he was to see him. Passepartout was walking towards the fore of the street when the detective inspector rushed towards him, exclaiming, "Fancy seeing you on the Rangoon!" "Mr. Fix, on board!" replied Passepartout, completely taken by surprise, recognizing his companion from the crossing on the Mongolia. "Imagine, I left you in Bombay, and I meet up with you again on the way to Hong Kong. Are you going around the world too?" "No, no. I'm intending to stop in Hong Kong, at least for a few days." "Oh," said Passepartout, who seemed taken aback for a moment. "But how come I haven't seen you on board since we left Calcutta?" "Well, I didn't feel too good. Seasickness. I was lying down in my cabin. The Bay of Bengal didn't suit me as much as the Indian Ocean. What about your master, Mr. Phileas Fogg?" "In perfect health and as punctual as his travel plan. Not a day late. Oh, Mr. Fix, you won't know this, but we have a young lady with us." "A young lady?" replied the detective, giving a perfect imitation of someone who didn't understand what he was being told. But Passepartout had soon put him in the picture. He recounted the incident at the temple in Bombay, the purchase of an elephant for £2,000, the business of the settee, the rescue of Mrs. Aouda, the conviction at the court in Calcutta, and the release on bail. Fix, who knew the last part of the story, pretended not to know any of it, and Passepartout let himself get carried away, relishing the opportunity to relate his adventure to a listener who showed so much interest in what he had to say. "But when you come down to it," asked Fix, "does your master intend to take this young lady to Europe?" "Certainly not, Mr. Fix, certainly not. We simply intend to hand her over safely." I'm getting my accents mixed up. We simply intend to hand her over safely to one of her relatives, a wealthy businessman in Hong Kong. Nothing doing, the detective said to himself, disguising his disappointment. How about a glass of gin, Mr. Passepartout? Delighted, Mr. Fix. At least we can do, the least we can do is drink to our meeting on board the Rangoon. And we will stop there, my dear scholars. How many chapters are we on? Okay, so we're not yet halfway through the book. We're almost halfway through the book, my dear scholars. There are a lot of chapters in this. There's 36 chapters of this book. We are currently just hitting chapter 17. So we have a ways to go. Oh, but my goodness, these chapters have been a little bit tough. Like I said, Verne was a man of his time, and while he does provide some wonderful descriptions of the landscapes, it is a little bit disheartening to hear some of his judgments of the locals. Um, I hope you're enjoying it though, my dear scholars. At the very least. But next week, as far as I know. So next Tuesday, if everything goes according to plan, we will be playing more Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney. And next Thursday, we will be reading more Around the World in 80 Days. Private Maverick. It's been enjoyable. Oh, I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it. It's yeah, it's a fun story, and it's an interesting story. It's also a very good story to see what people thought back then and how the view was of other continents and countries. It's essentially a window into 19th century travel and 19th century views of international affairs, which of course has changed quite a bit since then. So let's see who we can raid before we go. Is there anyone raid? Um, let's see if is there anyone else doing a reading? You doing good night, sweet prince. Thank you, thank you. Um, it looks like Myco Psycho is doing a reading of Walden. Interesting. Um, so let's go visit them. All right. So my dear scholars. Oh, wait, is there anyone else? I think that's it. So my dear scholars, I say unto you, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Till we meet each other again in the study. Take care, and I shall see you next time. Till then, farewell and bye bye.